What's up, you guys? This is Devin with CenturyFX Studios, back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about how Canon beat Nikon. Now, I already know what you're going to say in the comments below. You're going to be like, Devin, well, Nikon is a better company than Canon. I don't know why you're talking about this. It has no factual basis. Well, if you actually look at it in an objective way, based on the polling and all of the data coming back from Japan, it seems as though Nikon is under Canon when it comes to US sales, and US does a lot of purchasing for cameras and things of that nature. And on a mass scale, Nikon is not doing all that great. They bank a lot of money, and they've been putting out different memos and messages to people saying, hey, we're scaling back factories. We're not making as much cameras. We're focusing on other things like different type of cameras that might not be DSLRs, when DSLRs were their bread and butter back in the day. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, Nikon makes better pictures, they're more for photography, there's no way Nikon is ever going to be beat by Canon. Well, Canon is selling more cameras. Canon is the lead camera maker, even above Sony, even though Sony is the lead when it comes to full-frame mirrorless cameras. So you might be saying, well, how did Nikon get so behind? And you might be saying to yourself, Devin, you're biased. There's no way you can make this video objective. And I do actually shoot with Nikon D610. I shoot with the 7D, the 5D Mark II on the Canon side. I main with Canon stuff. I have Canon stuff when it comes to strobes and all this other stuff, Canon print or whatever. But at the end of the day, I shoot with a lot of brands, Panasonic, Sony, Nikon, and Canon, and I know there's benefits to both. I know that the Nikon is already going to be better in low light at cheaper prices than Canon is going to be. Nikon is going to be better when it comes to low light, but Canon has a better color science, and Canon is more usable. It's easier to work with the menus, and it's more of a multimedia camera. And don't let me start with the dual pixel AF. We're going to get to that in just a second. But yeah, Nikon is being trounced on by Canon in sales, and to understand why this is going on, you have to understand the history of Nikon versus Canon. Now, first off, you have to understand that Nikon's been around since 1917. That's about 103 years ago. Now, Canon's been around for a long time too, but Canon's only been around for about 87 years. It's about 23 years worth of a difference. And you might be saying to yourself, well, Nikon's been around a long time. Why isn't Nikon just the king of the hill? They have way more experience. They've been around for a long time. They probably made more mistakes and fixed more mistakes than Canon. Yeah, you're right and you're wrong at the same time. Yeah, they've been around longer than Canon, but they didn't always fix certain things that needed to be fixed, and they didn't always have the futuristic thinking. Back in the early days, about the early 1990s, early 2000s, around the late 1990s actually, early 2000s, Nikon started and Canon started to make the first DSLR. Around the year 2000 is when really electronic digital cameras came out. And so, since Kodak was introducing all this new technology to cameras, DSLRs, SLRs were made, but they started to become digital now. That's why DSLR. They used to be SLR film cameras, now they're DSLRs because you add electronics and all this automation to it. Now, with DSLR camera comes DSLR what? Lenses. And everybody who is a pro photographer or who has experience creating great images and knowing how to use their cameras knows that it's all about the lenses. It's all about what your lens is able to do, what focal distances you have. It's all about the lenses when it comes to image quality, not actually creating the entire process. But when you had Nikon making this jump to DSLRs, you also had Canon making this jump to DSLRs. Now, you had the Nikon camera that came out and the equivalent Canon camera that came out, but you have to have a lens system that goes with these new DSLR cameras. Well, Nikon was like, well, hey, you know, we already got some good lenses lined up from our SLR series from the film world. Why don't we do just small modifications to these already existing lenses? It'll save us money. It'll be easier on us, and it's just a small transition for something that was huge in the camera world. When you're adding electronics to cameras and all these computations was going on inside the cameras and everything was automated, it was big, it was huge for Nikon and Canon to get into this world, but it probably cost a lot of money. Those silicon full-frame chips, you have to understand that Nikon and Canon, when it came to making their first DSLRs, it was an expensive venture. Much like mirrorless cameras with all the new software needs to go inside of it and all this other stuff, going from film to digital was a big leap for these companies. And so they had to find ways to save money. So they didn't probably want to do a lot of risk taking. So Nikon was like, hey, well, let's just use our old lenses. It'll save us a lot of money. Let's just soup them up, you know, half physical, half electronic. That's essentially where they were going. And then Canon was like, we got film cameras with film lenses. When we go to DSLRs, we need to have DSLRs with a whole different lens system that are fully electronic. And now Canon is switching over to this electronic optical system, which ended up being an acronym for a Greek goddess called EOS. So now Canon has this EOS system. But back to Nikon versus Canon. You got Canon, a company that took a risk when they didn't have to, took a risk and made a better lens because they thought they could, put for the R&D and switched at a time where it was optimal to switch. You know, they have now these electronic cameras. They were like, we know that these cameras can operate better with our lenses if we make our lenses fully electronic. And that's what they did. Now we understand Canon to be this mecca of lenses. Some of the best lenses in the world, especially the new RF lenses for mirrorless cameras, are made by Canon. They have this EF system, which is catered for their full frame cameras, and the cameras that came out when they first arrived, like your crop frame sensor cameras and things of that nature. And then eventually they start to make EFS lenses that were specifically designed for their smaller APS-C size bodies. APS-C sensors that were actually even smaller than Nikon's, which means they probably made a healthy little profit after selling thousands and millions of cameras with smaller sensors, because like I told you before, those silicon sensors, those full frame sensors, were the most expensive parts of those cameras. And so when they made crop frame sensors, they were able to mass produce these crop frame sensors. Don't get me started on the 18 megapixel annoyance that Canon put us through in the early 2007, 8, 9, and 10. They were able to mass produce sensors of the same size and even a slight bit smaller than Nikon. And so this helped them save money to be able to invest more into the cameras and the lenses and all of this. And then they already had a better lens system where you didn't have to worry about it focusing too slow, you not being able to operate certain lenses with certain bodies, because later Nikon decided to make a new lens mount, which made it even worse because you have now third parties jumping into the system. Sigma, Tamron, Tokina, all of these different third parties that want to make lenses for your camera. Yongnuo even got into the mix. These third party Chinese brands want to make cheaper lenses for your customers to try to bring in some of that revenue, but at the same time, they kind of help your brand too, because if you thought about the, the L-mount alliance, as Jared Pollan would say, with Panasonic now, you have Leica now working with Panasonic to make higher quality lenses and things of that nature. So it doesn't have to always be a lens manufacturer versus another. But when it comes to Nikon making, lenses, when Sony, Tamron, and all these third parties tried to get in on the act when it came to making Nikon lenses, it was harder for them because the design of Nikon lenses were just all over the place. And so it's harder for third parties to make lenses for Nikon. And then on top of that, it's probably a little hard for Nikon to make lenses based on what they have already established. Now, if you speed on down, now we already know Nikon made a lens. I think they changed their lens mount later for their full frame bodies or whatever. It's just all kind of confusing on the Nikon end. That's why I don't really like dealing with Nikon. I like to put one lens on the Nikon D2X or the D2X and the D610, and I just like to, I don't want to deal with it after that. Don't make me buy no lenses from Nikon. I don't want to deal with it. Don't let no lenses break. But when it comes back to the Canon end of the spectrum, you fast forward all the way to the early, or I would say the 2008-ish, around that time, 2005, 2008, when the 5D Mark I and the 5D Mark II rear their head in. Now, the 5D Mark I wasn't as big of a competitor. Nikon was still pretty good. But then you had the 5D Mark II, and this changed everything. All right, Canon was already pretty much in the lead with their lenses and all of the stuff. Now, Nikon had smoothened out, and it really became a battle between Nikon versus Canon. Once they smoothed out all those lens issues and people started to understand where they were going with the lens nomenclature and how to mount things. But then Canon came out with the 5D Mark II. It ended up being in the show house for its video quality, the first full-frame DSLR camera with 1080p video ever for, Canon, and it wasn't even like it was the most expensive. It wasn't like it was the flagship. They could undercut the flagship. They just put it in like, you know, the level under the flagship, and you saved a lot more money. And not only that, you got premium full frame 1080p video, which Canon and Nikon recently have not been able to replicate that as well on their 4K sensors for their, you know, DSLR bodies. But nevertheless, the 5D Mark II came out, swooped the whole world, and ushered in this new age of video. This new age of, let's make video for YouTube, Facebook. Let's make this high quality video. These indie filmmakers were able to make something that Nikon wasn't even able. I don't even think Nikon even had a DSLR to come out that year with video. I think the D300 or 300D, all these numbers and names, they get mixed up with me, but it was like a D300 or a D90, or one of those two cameras were a big camera for Nikon where they came out with it, and it had video, but it didn't remotely have the video quality of a Canon, didn't have the color science of a Canon, and it didn't have the resolution of any Canon camera at the time. It took Nikon about 1.5 to 2 years to really implement video on a mass production basis for their DSLRs. And then on top of that, it took them a while to get 1080p in their videos. And by the time they got all that stuff, Canon had been leapfrogged them, creating what wasn't just a photography camera, but it ended up being a multimedia camera at that point. Now you got people taking video for the Avengers with the 5D Mark II as a crash cam or a B cam. It's like, wow. And it had a groundbreaking 21.1 megapixel sensor. The only other Canon that had a 21.1 megapixel sensor was the 1DS Mark III at the time that came out the year before in 2007. Even though Nikon had good cameras, they couldn't compete with all of that. And Canon was really thinking about their customers. They were like, oh, we only have one 21.1 megapixel sensor. Why don't we just put that in the step down the next year? And people saved a lot of money on not only full frame 1080p video that was shallow depth of field out of here. Now, mind you, most of the cinema cameras in the world back then had the APS-H kind of sensor or the Super 35 sensor. This was a little bit smaller than full frame. The APS-H sensor was the older sensor, not to be confused with the Super 35, but they're extremely close in size and resolution. Now, when you make a full frame sensor is way bigger. Well, not way bigger, but it's big enough to say it's bigger than the Super 35. This gives you a more compressed background, more background blur. Now you can imagine how the Nikon versus Canon debate is working now that you have people invested in your lenses, because once you get invested in the lenses and the bodies, you tend to stay with one brand. Now the loyalties are really opposed to each other, and we got a real battle now. Now, after the 5D Mark II comes out, there's a real battle of Nikon versus Canon, which one is better. And it's funny because if you don't shoot with both systems, you never know really what is the problem with both systems. You just take brand loyalty because it gives you what you like. You've learned on it, you've improved on it, and you've used it to the best of your ability, and you're rewarded for it. But you wouldn't know that Nikon had such a big problem with lenses unless you shot with Nikon. You wouldn't know if Canon had a big problem with low light in their sensors. You wouldn't know that they kind of have cruddy blacks and dynamic range with a lot of their DSLRs in comparison, especially their crop frame sensors in comparison to Nikon, unless you shot with Nikon and shot with Canon and compare it both of the two. Now we get to the end of the road where we are today, and you're talking about dual pixel autofocus with cameras like the 70D, the T4i, and all these cameras that came out in the 2010s, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, all these cameras coming out during that time, and you have Nikon not being able to produce anything close to that. Not only did Canon leapfrog Nikon when it came to video, but when it came to video autofocus and something that everybody needed with those big full frame sensors and shallow depth of field lenses with fast glass on them, you needed something to focus on, and you didn't need to stay behind the camera manually focusing everything every 5 seconds. I know the 5D Mark II is the I hate manually focusing with that thing. And the 7D Mark I, another manual focus video camera. T3i came out, that flip around screen. Now you can do video, flip out, And you what? And then the T4i, T5i, T6i, T7i, T8i came out, and they have these varying forms of dual pixel autofocus, but you can pretty much get the same thing for cheap. Then the EOS R came out, the 5D Mark IV came out, the 1DX Mark II came out. Then they came out with the 1DX Mark II, and it came out $500 under their flagship. Now you know there are two flagships: the D5, the D4, the D3S, the D3, and the 1DX, the 1DX Mark II, 1DX Mark III. All of these are flagships for both brands. They're knocking heads with each other. But you got to understand that they're almost essentially the same camera, same price and everything. But now you're talking about Canon. Let me cut $500 off the price. That was groundbreaking, especially since that camera wasn't much different. 1DX Mark I wasn't much different from 1DX Mark II. Now, it did have a big difference when it came to focusing, and I think the 1DX Mark II focuses better than the equivalent D4 at the time, even though the D4 has good low light on the Nikon side. But that's always been a thing for Nikon versus Canon. And now we're in the mirrorless world. Like I said, the EOS R has come out. The EOS RP has come out. Now, mind you, the Z6 and the Z7 are very good cameras. But we also have the new kid on the block, Sony, with the mirrorless cameras. You got to understand, there's so much competition for mirrorless cameras. The only person that could weather the storm of them coming late to the mirrorless world was the Canon brand, because they had so much that they did right in the past that when Nikon came out with the mirrorless cameras, and they did do a good job, the mirrorless cameras are nice. I would want one of them. You know, for those of you who say, oh, you're just a Canon tard, you just want to put down Nikon. No, this is the reality of the situation. Reality of the situation is Nikon is just not doing good. I want to upgrade my 5D Mark II at some point, use that as a B-roll camera, a good B-roll camera, doing close-ups and stuff like that for video and stuff like that, and then get a main camera that can do video and photos as a main camera. But I don't want to switch to Nikon, and I kind of don't want to switch to Sony because the menus are horrid. But Canon is the way to go because they're just all around good. They're not perfect at anything. They haven't mastered anything, in my opinion, but they're just all around good. Build quality, robust, menu system's great, easy to learn on, easy to use, easy to produce something, easy to focus with, good skin tones, everything straight out of camera. I really don't mess with things in post, but with Nikon cameras, especially the D610, in low light shadows, I get little twinge of green coming out in the skin tone sometimes, and it's not my thing. I'm not used to post-producing things like that. I tend to make a lot of my Nikon pictures black and white, even though the resolution is good, and even though the dynamic range is good. The colors are a little off, and a lot of times I tend to go black and white with them. But I'm done with CenturyFX Studios. I know this is a long video, guys, but that's me. You welcome to the channel. Welcome to the channel, baby. I do have shorter videos, but I had to really give it up for Nikon versus Canon. I mean, at one point I was always like, oh, I got to get Canon. Canon's the best. Canon's the best. And I joke about it nowadays, but I really know the differences, and I know that Canon is really the better company. Now, you might have your preferences on what you think is like the better company, you know, better camera on average as far as price, lenses, and all this other stuff. But when it comes to like the cold, hard paperwork, all the lenses, the graphs, all my favorite photographers are saying this, Nikon is just not doing all that great. And if you can't stay around to be in the fight of the Nikon and, you know, Canon debate, you're just not as good as Canon. It's just that simple. And I'm not trying to put Nikon down, but for those of us who are trying to get into photography, learning about which one is better, Nikon or Canon, I would advise you to go to Canon because Canon has more of a predictable future. I'm not going to say everything is cut straight and dry, but at the end of the day, Canon has won. And these are the reasons why. I'm Devin with CenturyFX Studios. Thanks for watching the video, and stay tuned for the next episode.